I never believed in Santa Claus. None of us kids did. Mom and Dad refused to let us. They couldn't afford expensive presents, and they didn't want us to think that we weren't as good as other kids who on Christmas morning found all sorts of fancy toys under the tree that were supposedly left by Santa Claus. So they told us all about how other kids were deceived by their parents, how the toys the grown-ups claimed were made by little elves wearing bell caps in the workshop at the North Pole actually had labels on them saying made in Japan. Try not to look down on those children, Mom said. It's not their fault they've been brainwashed into believing silly myths. We celebrated Christmas, but usually about a week after December 25th, when you could find particularly good bows and wrapping paper from the people that people had thrown away, and Christmas trees discarded on the roadside that still had most of their needles and even some of their silver tinsel hanging on them. Mom and Dad would give us a bag of marbles or a doll or a slingshot that had been marked way down in the after Christmas sale. Dad lost his job at the gypsum mine after getting into an argument with the foreman, and when Christmas came that year, we had no money at all. On Christmas Eve, Dad took each of his kids into the desert night one by one. I had a blanket wrapped around me, and when it was my turn, I offered to share it with Dad, but he said, no thanks. The cold never bothered him. I was 5 that year, and I sat next to Dad, and we looked up at the sky. Dad loved to talk about the stars. He explained to us how they rotated through the night sky as the Earth turned. He taught us to identify the constellations and how to navigate by the North Star. Those shining stars, he liked to point out, were one of the special treats for people like us who lived in the wilderness. Rich city folks, he'd say, lived in fancy apartments, but their air was so polluted they couldn't even see the stars. We'd have to be out of our minds to want to trade places with any of them. Pick out your favorite star, Dad said that night. He told me I could have it for keeps. He said it was my Christmas present. You can't give me a star, I said. No one owns the stars. That's right, Dad said. No one else owns them. You just have to claim it before anyone else does, like that Dago fellow Columbus claimed America for Queen Isabella. Claiming a star as your own has every bit as much logic to it. I thought about it and realized Dad was right. He was always figuring out things like that. I could have any star I wanted, Dad said, except Betelgeuse and Rigel, because Lori and Brian had already laid claim to them. I looked up at the stars and tried to figure out which was the best one. You could see hundreds, maybe thousands or even millions twinkling in the clear desert sky. The longer you looked and the more your eyes adjusted to the dark, the more stars you'd see, layer after layer of them gradually becoming visible. There was one in particular in the west above the mountains but low in the sky that shone more brightly than all the rest. I want that one, I said. Dad grinned. That's Venus, he said. Venus was only a planet, he went on, and pretty dinky compared to real stars. She looked bigger and brighter because she was much closer than the stars. Poor old Venus didn't even make her own light, Dad said. She shone only from the reflected light. He explained to me that planets glowed because they reflected light that was constant and stars twinkled because their light pulsed. I like it anyway, I said. I had admired Venus even before that Christmas. You could see it in the early evening, glowing on the western horizon, and if you got up early, you could still see it in the morning after the stars had disappeared. What the hell, Dad said, it's Christmas. You can have a planet if you want. And he gave me Venus. That evening, over Christmas dinner, we all discussed outer space. Dad explained light years and black holes and quasars and told us all about the special qualities of Betelgeuse, Rigel, and Venus. Betelgeuse was a red star in the shoulder of the constellation Orion. It was one of the largest stars you could see in the sky, hundreds of times bigger than the sun. It had burned brightly for millions of years and would soon become a supernova and burn out. I got upset that Lori had chosen a clunker of a star, but Dad explained that soon meant hundreds of thousands of years when you're talking about stars. Rigel was a blue star, smaller than Betelgeuse, Dad said, but even brighter. It was also in Orion. It was his left foot, which seemed appropriate because Brian was an extra fast runner. Venus didn't have any moons or satellites or even a magnetic field, but it did have an atmosphere sort of similar to Earth's, except it was super hot, about 500 degrees or more. So, Dad said, when the sun starts to burn out and Earth turns cold, everyone here might want to move to Venus to get warm, and they'll have to get permission from your descendants first. We laughed about all the kids who believed in the Santa myth and got nothing for Christmas but a bunch of cheap plastic toys. Years from now, when all the junk they got is broken and long forgotten, Dad said, you'll still have your stars. At twilight, once the sun had slid behind the Palin Mountains, the bats came out and swirled through the sky above the shacks of Midland. The old lady who lived next door warned us away from the bats. She called them flying rats and said one got caught in her hair once and went crazy clawing at her scalp. But I loved those ugly little bats, the way they darted past, their wings in a furious blur. Dad explained how they had sonar detectors, kind of like the ones in nuclear submarines. Brian and I would throw pebbles, hoping the bats would think they were bugs and eat them, and the weight of the pebbles would pull them down, and we could keep them as pets, tying a long string to their claws so they could still fly around. I wanted to train one to hang upside down from my finger, but those darn bats were too clever to fall for our trick. The bats were out, swooping and screeching, when we left Midland for Blythe. Earlier that day, Mom had told us that the baby had decided it was big enough to come out and soon join the family. Once we were on the road, Dad and Mom got into a big fight over how many months she'd been pregnant. Mom said she was 10 months pregnant. Dad, who'd fixed someone's transmission earlier that day and used the money he'd made to buy a bottle of tequila, said she probably lost track somewhere. I always carry children longer than most women, Mom said. Lori was in my womb for 14 months. Bullshit, Dad said, unless Lori's part elephant. Don't you make fun of me or my children, Mom yelled. Some babies are premature. Mine were all post-mature. That's why they're so smart. Their brains had longer to develop. Dad said something about freaks of nature, and Mom called Dad a Mr. Know-it-all smarty pants who refused to believe that she was special. Dad said something about Jesus H. Christ on a goddamn crutch, not taking that much time to gestate. Mom got upset at Dad's blasphemy, reached her foot over to the driver's side, and stomped on the brake. It was in the middle of the night, and Mom bolted out of the car and ran into the darkness. You crazy bitch, Dad hollered. Get your goddamn ass back in this car. You make me, Mr. Tough Guy, she screamed as she ran away. Dad jerked the steering wheel to one side and drove off the road into the desert after her. Lori, Brian, and I braced one another with our arms, like we always did when Dad went on some wild chase that we knew would get bumpy. Dad stuck his head out the window as he drove, hollering at Mom, calling her a stupid whore and a stinking cunt and ordering her to get back in the car. Mom refused. She was ahead of us, bobbing in and out of the desert brush. Since she never used curse words, she was calling Dad names like blankety blank and worthless drunk and so. Dad stopped the car and then jammed down on the accelerator and popped the clutch. We shot forward towards Mom, who screamed and jumped out of the way. Dad turned around and went for her again. It was a moonless night, so we couldn't see Mom except when she ran into the beam of headlights. She kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes wider like a hunted animal's. We kids cried and begged Dad to stop, but he ignored us. I was even more worried about the baby inside Mom's swollen belly than I was about her. The car bounced on holes and rocks, brush scratching against its sides and dust coming through the open windows. Finally, Dad cornered Mom against some rocks. I was afraid he might smush her with a car, but instead he got out and dragged her back, legs flailing, and threw her into the car. We banged back through the desert and onto the road. Everyone was quiet except Mom, who was sobbing that she really did carry Lori 14 months. Mom and Dad made up the next day, and by late afternoon, Mom was cutting Dad's hair in the living room of the apartment we'd rented in Blythe. He'd taken off his shirt and was sitting backwards on a chair with his head bowed and his hair combed forward. Mom was snipping away while Dad pointed out the parts that were way still too long. When they were finished, Dad combed his hair and announced that Mom had done a hell of a fine shearing job. Our apartment was in a one-story cinder block building on the outskirts of town. It had a big blue and white plastic sign in the shape of an oval and a boomerang that said the LBJ Apartments. I thought it stood for Lori, Brian, and Jeanette, but Mom said the LBJ were the initials of the president, who she added was a crook and a warmonger. A few truck drivers and cowboys had rooms at the LBJ Apartments, but most of the other people who lived there were migrant workers and their families, and we heard them talking through the thin sheetrock walls. Mom said it was one of the bonuses of living at the LBJ Apartments because we'd be able to pick up a little Spanish without even studying. Blythe was in California, but the Arizona border was within spitting distance. People who lived there liked to say that the town was 150 miles west of Phoenix, 250 miles east of Los Angeles, and smack dab in the middle of nowhere. But they always said it like they were bragging. Mom and Dad weren't exactly crazy about Blythe. Too civilized, they said, and downright unnatural, too, since the town the size of Blythe had any business existing out in the Mojave Desert. It was near the Colorado River, founded back in the 19th century by some guy who figured he could get rich turning the desert into farmland. He dug a bunch of irrigation ditches that drained water out of the Colorado River to grow lettuce and grapes and broccoli right there in the middle of all the cactus and sagebrush. Dad got disgusted every time we drove past one of those farm fields with their irrigation ditches as wide as moats. It's a goddamn perversion of nature, he'd say. If you want to live in a farmland, haul your sorry hide off to Pennsylvania. If you want to live in a desert, eat prickly pears, not iceberg pansy-ass lettuce. That's right, Mom would say. Prickly pears have more vitamins anyway. Living in a big city like Blythe meant I had to wear shoes. It also meant I had to go to school. School wasn't so bad. I was in the first grade, and my teacher, Miss Cook, always chose me to read aloud when the principal came into the classroom. The other students didn't like me very much because I was so tall and pale and skinny, and I always raised my hand too fast and waved it frantically in the air whenever Miss Cook asked a question. A few days after I started school, 4 Mexican girls followed me home and jumped me in an alleyway near the LBJ apartments. They beat me up pretty bad, pulling my hair and tearing my clothes and calling me a teacher's pet and a matchstick. I came home that night with scraped knees and elbows and a busted lip. Looks to me like you got in a fight, Dad said. He was sitting at the table, taking apart an old alarm clock with Brian. Just a little dust up, I said. That was the word Dad always used after he'd been in a fight. How many were there? 6, I lied. Is that split lip okay? He asked. This little scratch, I asked. You should have seen what I did to him. That's my girl, Dad said, and went back to the clock. But Brian kept looking over at me. The next day, when I got to the alley, the Mexican girls were waiting for me. Before they could attack, Brian jumped out from behind a clump of sagebrush, waving a yucca branch. Brian was shorter than me and just as skinny, with freckles across his nose and sandy red hair that fell into his eyes. He wore my hand-me-down pants, which I had inherited from Lori and then passed on to him, and they were always sliding off his bony behind. Just back off now and everyone can walk away with their limbs still attached, Brian said. It was another of Dad's lines. The Mexican girls just stared at him before bursting into laughter. Then they surrounded him. Brian did fairly well fending them off until the yucca branch broke. Then he disappeared behind a flurry of swinging fists and kicking feet. I grabbed the biggest rock I could find and hit one of the girls on the head with it. From the jolt in my arm, I thought I'd cracked her skull. She sank to her knees. One of her friends pushed me to the ground and kicked me in the face, and then they all ran off, the girl I had hit holding her head as she staggered along. Brian and I sat up. His face was covered with sand. All I could see were his blue eyes peering out and a couple of spots of blood seeping through. I wanted to hug him, but that would have been too weird. Brian stood up and gestured for me to follow him. We climbed through a hole in the chain-link fence he had discovered that morning and ran into the iceberg lettuce farm next to the apartment building. I followed him through the rows of big green leaves, and we eventually settled down to a feast, burying our faces in huge, wet heads of lettuce and eating until our stomachs ached. I guess we scared him off pretty good, I said to Brian. I guess, he said. He never liked to brag, but I could tell he was proud that he had taken on 4 bigger, tougher kids, even if they were girls. Lettuce war, Brian shouted. He tossed a half-eaten head at me like a grenade. We ran along the rows, pulling up heads and throwing them at each other. A crop duster flew overhead. We waved as it made a pass above the field. A cloud sprayed out from behind the plane, and a fine white powder came sprinkling down on our heads. 2 months after we moved to Blythe, when Mom said she was 12 months pregnant, she at last gave birth. After she'd been in the hospital for 2 days, we all drove out to pick her up. Dad left us kids waiting in the car with the engine idling while he went in for Mom. They came running out with Dad's arm around Mom's shoulders. Mom was cradling a bundle in her arms and giggling sort of guiltily like she'd stolen a candy bar from a dime store. I figured they had checked out, Rex Walls style. What is it? Lori asked as we sped away. Girl, Mom said. Mom handed me the baby. I was going to turn 6 in a few months, and Mom said I was mature enough to hold her the entire way home. The baby was pink and wrinkly, but absolutely beautiful, with big blue eyes, soft wisps of blonde hair, and the tiniest fingernails I'd ever seen. She moved in confused, jerky motions, as if she couldn't understand why Mom's belly wasn't still around her. I promised her I'd always take care of her. The baby went without a name for weeks. Mom said she wanted to study it first, the way you would study the subject of a painting. We had lots of arguments over what the name should be. I wanted to call her Rosita after the prettiest girl in my class, but Mom said the name was too Mexican. I thought we weren't supposed to be prejudiced, I said. I'm not being prejudiced, Mom said. It's a matter of accuracy and labeling. She told us that both of our grandmothers were angry because neither Lori nor I had been named after them, so she decided to call the baby Lily Ruth Maureen. Lily was Mom's mother's name, and Irma Ruth was Dad's mother's name, but we called the baby Maureen, a name Mom liked because it was diminutive of Mary, so she'd also be naming the baby after herself, but pretty much no one would know it. That, Dad told us, would make everyone happy except his mom, who hated the name Ruth and wanted the baby called Irma, and Mom's mom, who would hate sharing her namesake with Dad's mom. A few months after Maureen was born, a squad car tried to pull us over because the brake lights on the green caboose weren't working. Dad took off. He said that if the cops stopped us, they'd find out that we had no registration or insurance and that the license plate had been taken off into the car, and they'd arrest us all. After barreling down the highway, he made a screeching U-turn with us kids feeling like the car was going to tumble over on its side. But the squad car made one too. Dad peeled through Blythe at 100 miles an hour, ran a red light, cut the wrong way up a one-way street, and other cars honking and pulling over. He made a few more turns, then headed down an alley and found an empty garage to hide in. We heard the sound of the siren a couple of blocks away, and then it faded. Dad said that since the Gestapo would have their eyes out for the green caboose, we'd have to leave it in the garage and walk home. The next day he announced that Blythe had become a little too hot and we were hitting the road again. This time he knew where we were going. Dad had been doing some research and settled on a town in northern Nevada called Battle Mountain. There was gold in Battle Mountain, Dad said, and he intended to go after it with a prospector. Finally, we were going to strike it rich. Mom and Dad rented a big U-Haul truck. Mom explained that since only she and Dad could fit in the front of the U-Haul, Lori, Brian, Maureen, and I were in for a treat. We got to ride in the back. It would be fun, she said, a real adventure, but there wouldn't be any lights, so we would have to use all of our resources to entertain one another. Plus, we were not allowed to talk. Since it was illegal to ride in the back, anyone who heard us might call the cops. Mom told us the trip would be about 14 hours if we took the highway, but we should tack on another couple of hours because we might make some scenic detours. We packed up what furniture we had. There wasn't much, mostly parts for the prospector and a couple of chairs and Mom's oil paintings and art supplies. When we were ready to leave, Mom wrapped Maureen in a lavender blanket and passed her to me, and we kids all climbed into the back of the U-Haul. Dad closed the doors. It was pitch black and the air smelled stale and dusty. We were sitting on the ribbed wooden floor on frayed, stained blankets used to wrap furniture, feeling for one another with our hands. "Here goes the adventure," I whispered. "Shh," Lori said. The U-Haul started up and lurched forward. Maureen let loose with a loud, high-pitched wail. I shushed her and rocked her and patted her, but she kept crying, so I gave her to Lori, who whispered sing-song into her ear and told jokes. That didn't work either, so we begged Maureen to please stop crying. Then we just put our hands over our ears. After a while, it got cold and uncomfortable in the back of the dark U-Haul. The engine made the floor vibrate, and we'd all go tumbling whenever we hit a bump. Several hours had passed. By then, we were all dying to pee and wondering if Dad was going to pull over for a rest stop. Suddenly, with a bang, we hit a huge pothole, and the back doors on the U-Haul flew open. The wind shrieked through the compartment. We were afraid we were going to get sucked out, and we all shrank back against the prospector. The moon was out. We could see the glow from the U-Haul's taillights and the road we'd come down, stretching back to the silvery desert. The unlocked doors swung back and forth with loud clangs. Since the furniture was stored between us and the cabin, we couldn't knock on the wall to get to Mom and Dad's attention. We banged on the sides of the U-Haul and hollered as loud as we could, but the engine was too noisy and they didn't hear us. Brian crawled to the back of the van. When one of the doors swung in, he grabbed it, but it flew open again, jerking him forward. I thought the door was going to drag Brian out, but he jumped back just in time and scrambled along the wooden floor towards Lori and me. Brian and Lori held tight to the prospector, which Dad had tied securely with ropes. I was holding Maureen, who for some strange reason had stopped crying. I wedged myself into a corner. It seemed like we'd have to ride it out. Then a pair of headlights appeared way in the distance behind us. We watched as the car slowly caught up with the U-Haul. After a few minutes, it pulled up right behind us, and the headlights caught us there in the back of the cab. The car started honking and flashing its brights. Then it pulled up and passed us. The driver must have signaled Mom and Dad because the U-Haul slowed to a stop, and Dad came running back with a flashlight. "What the hell is going on?" he asked. He was furious. We tried to explain that it wasn't our fault the doors blew open, but he was still angry. I knew that he was scared too, maybe even more scared than angry. "Was that a cop?" Brian asked. "No," Dad said, "and you're sure as hell lucky it wasn't, or he'd be hauling your asses off to jail." After we peed, we climbed back into the truck and watched as Dad closed the doors. The darkness enveloped us again. We could hear Dad locking the doors and double-checking them. The engine started, and we continued on our way. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and then I will pick up the next section. I'm going to turn off the camera now, so hang on one second.